Okay. The next speaker is Antoine Diez from RIKEN. Antoine Diez from RIKEN-iTHEMS, and the title is Scaling Limits for Some Particle Systems Related to Biology. So please.
Okay. Thank you very much for the introduction. Maybe I should take the microphone. This one.
Could you turn on
Okay. Okay. Can you hear me? Yes, I think so. So thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation to this very interesting workshop. So as my title suggests, my research is maybe a bit different than many people here. So I will try to entertain you for the next 30 minutes or so with some topics that I find interesting, a bit at the intersection between math, physics, and biology. So I will start with something that Hamasaki-san actually mentioned a bit yesterday, which is a very old problem for physicists, also for mathematicians, but still very active line of research, at least for the mathematician. And so the problem is, how do you derive macroscopic laws, so thermodynamics or fluid mechanics, from microscopic interaction rules? So that for physicists, probably you know that this idea comes back from Boltzmann at the end of the 19th century, Maxwell also. And for mathematicians, it became a real problem when Hilbert framed this in his sixth problem. So in broad terms, the problem is just how do we axiomatize physics in terms of mathematics. And in particular, he mentioned the works of Boltzmann and says that we should seek to develop mathematically the limiting processes which lead from the atomistic view to the laws of motion of continua. So what he had in mind as a system was probably this simple hard sphere gas that was already in Boltzmann work. So it's a very simple system where you just have hard sphere, they collide, they preserve momentum, energy. But somehow this system, when the number of particles is large, it already contains thermodynamics and even fluid mechanics. So it's a very rich system. It's a very rich system, but it's very difficult to study for mathematicians. So actually the first good formalization of the notion of molecular chaos, which was clear for the physicists, it only appeared in the work of Katz in the 50s. Then the first derivation of the Boltzmann equation, but only for short times, was in the 60s. And it was not completely rigorous. It has been made rigorous about 10 years ago. In the 80s, Kaflis showed that you can derive the Euler equations from the Boltzmann equation, so the first link with fluid mechanics. And so all these works have been discussed in this line of works by a group of French mathematicians, in Lyon in particular. And very recently, Yudeng, so last month, was awarded the Fields Medal to somehow giving a first satisfactory solution to Hilbert's sixth problem. And in particular, he and his collaborators, they managed to derive the Euler and Navier-Stokes equation from this hard sphere gas on arbitrary long time. So that's a very difficult problem for mathematicians. So of course, I will not explain everything here. I will work on systems that are much simpler. But I just want to make things clear so that we agree on what we call a particle system. So for me, an n-particle system is just a stochastic process or a collection of n stochastic processes in a vector space on a manifold. The only important thing is that they should be exchangeable. So if I take the law, the probability distribution of the n-particle system, the label doesn't matter. So I can take any permutation of the labels. The probability distribution should remain the same. So there are some characterizations for that kind of symmetric probability distribution. So of course, you have the n-particle distribution that contains everything you want. But that's a probability distribution in a very high dimensional space, so that's not really something you want to work with. So you can look at the case marginal. So for each integer k smaller than n, you can compute the probability distribution for a group of k particles, and because they are exchangeable, you can take any of them. It doesn't matter. So this is a probability distribution in a slightly smaller dimensional space, but then you have a hierarchy of marginals. So of course they are all coupled, so that makes things complicated. And another characterization that may be easier to understand here is the empirical measure. So it's just a measure, you just take the sum of direct masses at the positions of all the particles. So that's a probability measure on a very low dimensional space, but that's a random measure. So it's a somehow complicated object, but that also contains everything up to reordering. So with that, we can formulate what molecular chaos means. So that's the definition of CATS. So we say that a system is chaotic for some distribution f of t at a given time if one of these conditions holds, so they are equivalent. So the first one is that for any k is marginal, then when n is large, they are essentially a tensor product. So if you take k particle, when n is large, they should be statistically independent. And that's equivalent to say that the empirical measure converges towards this f of t. So that's a kind of law of large number, but because the particles interact with each other, then they are not independent anymore, so there is something non-trivial here. And what CATS call propagation of chaos is when you assume chaos at initial time, that you can always do, but then the particle interacts, so they are not so independent anymore, but you say that there is propagation of chaos when you can prove chaos at a later time. So, of course, yes?
Second point.
Yes?
Does the limit depend on time?
At a given time. So you fix a time, and you check, so you fix a time, you have a empirical distribution, and you look at the limit.
Imagining some stabilizations, is that right? There. Doing that is invariant.
Of course it will depend on the evolution, but you can always look at what's the distribution at a given time. Does it make sense?
No, I'm just wondering what's the meaning of that thing.
So the meaning of that statement, the empirical measure is this object, right. So it's a random measure, but it's a probability measure.
Sum of the other function.
No, so this is the position of a particle.
Yeah.
Yeah, so is it clear? So this is just a measure, so it's an object in a space of probability measure, and you compute the limit when n is large. That's the only thing I do at a fixed time.
Yeah, the second condition seems to be a definition of f of t.
It's the definition of being ft chaotic.
Well, yeah, but what's the definition of ft?
That's a good point. So then you want to show that your system is chaotic, so it behaves as ft. So then the question is, how do you characterize this limit f of t? And that's all the goal of this research somehow, is to be able to characterize a limit, and usually would be by the solution of an equation. So for the hard sphere gas that I showed before, the good limit, or the good ft, is the solution of the Boltzmann equation. But if you change the interaction, then you have another equation, maybe. Right. So there are two things to prove here.
You're saying this limit is independent of the interactions? Is that the statement?
This property is just a property, and the limit you get, of course, depends on the interaction. Right? So maybe it will be clear a bit in the next slide. So if you change the kind of interaction you consider, then of course you change the limit. So the first one is the hard sphere gas. So it's just a sequence of binary collisions. So it's very simple to write a particle system. Right? It's a very simple equation, which is derivative of position is velocity. The acceleration is 0, but when they collide, then you assume energy and momentum conservation, so you have like the velocities after the collisions. Now, if you assume that, then all the 1 century or more than 126 years of research have led to the conclusion that this property is true and the limit is the solution of a Boltzmann equation. Right? Now it's very difficult, and why is it difficult? Maybe that from that definition where I say that essentially it means like statistical independence, chaos. It's difficult because when two particles collide, then they are not independent anymore, they are correlated. So if you want to remove the correlations or to check that the correlations are small, you need to compute all the correlation history. So you have to go back in time and say that, oh, these two particles interacted, but then it was a long time ago, so the correlation is very weak. So that's a very difficult combinatorial problem to reconstruct that kind of collision history. So people, and in particular McKean, just decided to introduce different modes of interactions, in particular this mean field diffusion problem. So in that kind of system, you assume that the particles, they all interact at all time with each other, so say with like this potential, but all the interactions of order 1 over n. So the correlations are always there, but they are small. So you assume that when n is large, then the correlation is not that big. So it's a very general framework, like the Kuramoto model would fit that framework. The machine learning, deep learning model that we saw yesterday also would be mean field diffusion. And then the limit is not the Boltzmann equation, is a nonlinear Fokker-Planck equation. So then when we know the PDE, then we can study it and see what we can extract from it. So in the rest of my talk, I will discuss two more recent problems in that framework. So the framework is always the same. I have a system of particles. I want to see what's the behavior when the number of particles is large. So I want to prove that there is propagation of chaos towards some kind of PDE and then study the PDE. So first topic would be to discuss like some kind of active matter problem. And the second topic is more related to biology, in particular morphogenesis. In that case, the particles are biological cells, right? So for the first topic, and because I want to show as many things as I can, I will introduce a new way for the particles to interact, which is a bit intermediate between the binary collisions and the mean field diffusion. So this is motivated by, say, geometrically enriched particle in active matter. So you can think of like birds or flying animals. They like to fly in somewhere, like they follow each other, but they also like to have all have a preferred speed, right? So they don't want to fly too slowly and not too fast. So usually we model them as, okay, they fly at a constant speed. But then that means that the speed belongs to a sphere, like, which is manifold. You can think also of particles that have a bit more complicated internal structure. So in that case, if it's like this dolphin, they evolve in a 3D environment. So they have a direction of motion, but they also have a body orientation. So in that case, if you want to describe them, then you have to work in a manifold, which is the manifold of rotation matrices. And then if you want to study like this kind of polymers, they have this weird shape. So if you want to describe them, there's the orientation up to the sign somehow. So it's a kind of a more projective plane manifold. So if you want to describe like a particle system in that kind of geometrically enriched framework, then it's a bit difficult to write a diffusion model, because then you have to write diffusion on a manifold. Of course, that's something we can do, but we can do something simpler, and which is this kinetic jump process. So here, the space where the particle evolved is a product space, with RD is just their position, and M is a manifold, so it's their orientation. So of course, from an orientation, I need to define an actual velocity. So it's very easy, like for SO3, I take the first vector, for instance. So that's kind of velocity map. And then the time derivative of the position is the velocity. And the way the velocity evolves is a bit different. I just resample the velocity at random time. And the way I resample the velocity is I take a arbitrary distribution in my manifold, so you can think of a Maxwellian. And so the only thing I have to define is the center of that distribution. The center of a distribution is not very difficult to define. I can take, like, simplest thing I can imagine is like the average. So that means that at this random time, you compute the average around the particles. So each particle compute the average of the orientation of the other particle around them, and then resample a new orientation with respect to this kind of Maxwellian-like distribution, which in this case is called a von Mises distribution. So the picture is like this. They move in straight line, and at random time, they just change the orientation to align with the others. So that was a kind of big topics in active matter, because people have realized, since the work of Vicek in particular, that when there are many particles, then you have weird structure emerging, in particular these traveling bands. But if you play a bit with the scaling factors, then you have like weird clusters. You can have like vortices here. If you play with the geometry of the space, so here's a kind of hyperbolic space, you have like different kind of patterns. So there's just a Vicek model, so where the manifold is just a sphere, so it's a constant speed motion. If you do that in SO3, then you have the same kind of patterns where you have emergence of order, so here there are particles that initially move in every direction, and then they somehow synchronize, and eventually they all go in the same direction. So how do we study that kind of system? So the first thing is, okay, we have to prove a propagation of chaos properties. So since the mode of interaction is a bit different than what I introduced before, so there is a theorem here to show what equation you have, and the equation is a BGK equation here. So it's kind of a same type of the Boltzmann or four-complex equation, but a bit simpler. It's just a transport equation plus a relaxation term towards the distribution I imposed, but it's nonlinear in the sense that the parameters of these distributions are the moment of the solution of the equation. So okay, it's a theorem that is not so difficult to prove. We can just follow a kind of scheme that has been proposed by Sneedman in particular in the 80s, but here a bit adapted to this geometrical framework. And for that, I will just mention two results in SO3, and then I will move to a more biology topic. So the first one is what people in active matter are very interested in, is phase transition. So at least for the space homogeneous equation, so I remove the space, we can prove that there is a phase transition between order and disorder, which means that if the density of particles is large enough, so here the space homogeneous, the density is a fixed parameter, then in long time, the particle distribution f of t that comes as solution of this BGK equation converges towards the distribution I want, but the parameter is either 0, so it's disorder if the density is low, or a fixed element of the manifold if the density is high. We can also somehow rescale time and space to have a more fluid-like description, and in this case we obtain, as we could expect, a kind of system of Euler equations, but here with many additional terms here in red that are essentially here to preserve the geometrical constraint. And this system is actually interesting because it has like unexpected traveling wave solutions. So writing all the computation would not be very interesting for you here, but just to mention that by adding this kind of active matter element to the system, we get other fluid equations that have somehow solution that we did not expect first. Okay, so in the remaining time, I will just to mention what I'm working on more recently, which is mathematical biology, so morphogenesis. So everyone here in this room is somehow an aggregate of cells. but not so long time ago, a few years ago, everyone here was just a spherical aggregate of cells without any shape, and now you all have very complex and beautiful shape. So how does it happen, right? There is some magic happening here. So I'm not going to look at everything, just maybe the development of the hand here. So the hand is a good example because you have like 5 fingers emerging, it's a complex shape. So we can make hand in a tube. You just take cells from embryo and then you culture them in a tube and suddenly you have emergence of this kind of finger behavior. So here to see what the cells will become the fingers, they are colored in green in the experiment and the other in magenta. And so how can you explain that? So of course you have to know a bit how the cell interact. So it's actually a beautiful topic. And okay, I'm not going to give a lecture in biology, I'm also not a biologist. So I will just mention that the cell, the way they interact, they just deform their body and they attach something and then they pull. So this something can be the environment or they can be other cells. Here there is no environment in the experiment because they evolve in a gel. So they just grab other cells and pull. So it's a very simple system. In physics, it's just attraction repulsion. So you can write a very simple equation with the attraction repulsion force you like, your favorite potential. That doesn't matter. So that's very simple to model. But then it doesn't say in which direction the cell move. And that's given by chemistry somehow. So in our body, there are some diffusing molecules called morphogens that diffuse in the body, and the gradient of their concentration tells the cell, oh, you should move in that direction. And chemistry is simple in a sense that the equations are just reaction diffusion equations. So you just have to couple our particle system with reaction diffusion PD. So with that, we were able to write a relatively simple model that contains just what I said. So attraction repulsion coupled with reaction diffusion. So I don't want to spend a lot of time on that because there is a coffee break soon and that's very important, I guess. So I just want to mention that attraction repulsion, it gives the force, like the direction, you know, it has to be like between the cell center. So the only thing that the chemistry can do is to change the magnitude of the force. And it cannot change the direction of the force, so only the magnitude. And then you have to include somehow the angle between the gradient of your morphogen and the gradient and the direction of the force. And that's the only thing you can change in your model. So there are not so many parameters that you can include if you want to include only these ingredients. So that's a bit what we wrote here. So I don't go into the detail, I just show you the fun part, which are the simulations. And okay, as you can expect, otherwise I wouldn't present that. We can reproduce the experiment well with just this ingredient. And we can change all the parameters to understand a bit better why do these fingers emerge. But because I'm still a mathematician, understanding means I want to write an equation and see something analytically, not only in the simulation. So for that, I take a mean field limit, propagation of chaos, and obtain a kind of a PD system, which looks like the one I showed before, kind of nonlinear Fokker-Planck equation. But the interaction here in the term in the divergent is a bit complicated because it's a non-local operator. So all these terms are like the interaction between the morphogen and the attraction repulsion forces. And this term here is mostly due to repulsion potential that tunes a bit how hard the cells are. So this system is not so easy to study. But then if we rescale the time and space and use a more, like in that case, a diffusive rescaling of time, then we can expand that and have a more local description. And the local description here is given by this complicated set of equations. But it's actually not so complicated. So there are 4 equations, one for the green cells that become the fingers, one for the magenta cells that just form the hand, and then 2 equations for the morphogens. So if you break all the terms, we can see advection. Okay, that's not very surprising. Like the cells, they move along gradients. That's what we expect them to do. There is a term that comes from attraction repulsion, and that's a Cahn-Hillard equation if you are familiar with that. And then there is a strange term that somehow emerged from the model, which can be seen as an anisotropic diffusion term. So if we look at the literature on the Canillard equation, because that's somehow the main dominating term here, then it's very linked to what's called fingering instabilities in physics, and has nothing to do with fingers, but it has something to do with just interface between fluids. So if you want to model that kind of system where you have a dark fluid here in a lighter gray fluid, they are immiscible, and the gray fluid, the light gray fluid, is a bit more viscous, and then you keep injecting that darker gray fluid here. So you would expect the droplet to expand somehow isotropically, which is not what happens. Actually, there are instabilities forming, and that create that kind of interesting patterns that are often referred as fingering instabilities. So you can write an equation for that. Is the kind of rho is the density of this dark gray fluid. U is the fluid velocity, so a solution of whatever equation you want, and then a Canillard term here. So our equation is, that's my last slide. Don't worry. Our equation here, at least one of them, has exactly the same structure somehow. We have a kind of advection, we have a Canillard term, but then we don't add anything to the system. The number of cells is somehow conserved. But we have this new anisotropic diffusion term, and somehow the diffusion, it does exactly the same. It tries to expand to expand the cell density towards the outside. So if we do simulation of this some kind of enriched Canillard equation, then you get the same thing as the particle system, which made us believe that these fingers are actually also fingering instabilities, because they are described by the same kind of equations. So with that, I will conclude. So I hope that I was able to give you a kind of overview of the equation we can get from other fields than just classical mathematical physics. So I'm in just a brief advertisement for iTHEMS for the people not here. So I'm in the mathematical application research team, but like Ricardo, I spend a lot of time with the people in biology, so we have a quite active group of people working on biological problems in iTHEMS. And I say that because there are, of course, biologists, but there are people with various backgrounds in physics, mathematics, statistics. So it's also a good environment to find new problems I think could be interesting for anyone here. So with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you for nice talk. And is there any comment and question?
Why do we have 5 fingers? That's a very good question. So in the model, I know how to control the number of fingers. So I know that depending on the ratio of cells, like the ratio of green and magenta cells, I can have different number of fingers. I know that if I change diffusion of the morphogen, I can change the number of fingers. So in the equation, there are many places that can control the number of fingers. What happens in the biology, I don't know. And that's actually a very open problem in biology, because... Sorry? I don't think so. I think even in biology they don't know, because in this very simple experiment where you make a hand in a tube, you can also obtain as many fingers as you want. But in nature, like the typical idea is that if you double the size of the cell aggregate, you double the number of fingers. That's not what happened in biology. We all have 5 fingers, and we don't have the same size. And the mice, they also have 5 fingers. So there is something in the biology that I don't know, that probably biologists also don't know. So sorry, it's a bit disappointing.
Okay. Any other question? Okay.
You would prefer to assume that all the parts here are the same size. Which
Yes.
implies that, sure. So how strong of an assumption is that a really strong assumption to get to?
Somehow it's a strong assumption because I want the particles to be exchangeable.
Yes.
So okay. If you assume that the size are distributed independently for all particles according to some fixed distribution, then you don't break the exchangeability. So it's not a strong assumption. And I guess the hard sphere gas will be the same because you can compute the energy and momentum conservation with different size or different masses, right? So that wouldn't change so much, I would say. For the dolphins, I assume that they are all the same. That's a very big weakness of the model. I apologize.
Thank you. Another question? Comment? Okay. Now let's thank speaker again.
Thank you.